Today we'll be looking at 10 terrifying true stories of cave exploration gone terribly wrong. These aren't tales of thrill-seeking gone too far. They're chilling reminders of how quickly the underground world can turn hostile. Each story takes us deep into the earth, where solid rock becomes a maze and darkness becomes an enemy. These are places where one overlooked detail can mean the difference between life and death. From military missions to solo expeditions, from rising floodwaters to sudden rockfall, these incidents expose the terrifying unpredictability of caves. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The first story begins with 4 young men diving into one of Australia's most breathtaking underwater caves, the Shaft. It was May 28, 1973. They were experienced, well-equipped, and full of confidence. But just hours later, they vanished without a trace. What rescuers found 3 days later left everyone stunned. The Shaft, hidden in a quiet farming area, is well known for its stunning, crystal-clear waters. It's a cave system that draws divers from all over the world, but it's not a place for beginners. At over 40 meters deep, with tight, twisting tunnels and an eerie silence, it's as dangerous as it is beautiful. Despite the risks, these young men were experienced. They knew what they were doing. They had the right equipment. They were ready. They geared up, checking their tanks and ensuring everything was in order. As they plunged into the cold water, everything seemed peaceful. The water was clear, the cave was quiet, and they were surrounded by nothing but the deep, still world of the underground. For a while, all was calm. They descended into the darkness, moving deeper and deeper into the cave's twisting corridors. But what seemed like a simple exploration quickly turned into a deadly trap. The Shaft is not a straightforward dive. It's a labyrinth of narrow passageways, deep chambers, and sharp turns. The further you go, the more disorienting it becomes. But at first, the 4 divers felt in control. They had their guide ropes to help them find their way back, and they felt safe, diving in pairs, knowing exactly where they were and how far they had gone. However, as the minutes passed, the further they ventured, the more dangerous it became. Then, something went wrong. They became disoriented. There's no one clear reason for why things went wrong, but divers often get lost in places like this. The tight passageways and dark waters play tricks on your mind. Nitrogen narcosis, a kind of underwater intoxication caused by breathing nitrogen at depth, affects every diver differently, and it's easy to lose focus. It slows your reactions. It clouds your judgment. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it becomes. The young men, despite their skill, began to lose their bearings. The rope had tangled. The water current shifted. The dark, still cave distorted their sense of time and space. What had started as a fun dive was now turning into a nightmare. They realized they were too deep. They had run out of air. Panic set in, but it was too late. The air in their tanks was gone. They had no way to get to the surface. They were trapped. In those final moments, the 4 men struggled, but the water was too cold, and their oxygen-deprived brains were too foggy. Time felt like it was moving in slow motion. Every breath became more desperate. But they couldn't find their way out. What's even worse is that in a situation like this, panic only makes things worse. Divers begin to act irrationally, losing their focus. They could have tried to go back, but they couldn't find the way. Instead, they found themselves spiraling deeper into confusion, disoriented and exhausted. They knew they couldn't survive long, but there was nothing they could do. By the time rescue divers were called, it was too late. For days, no one knew what had happened to the 4 young men. Search teams scoured the cave, but the search was slow, risky, and treacherous. The cave system's twists and turns made it difficult to navigate. And then, on the 3rd day, the rescuers finally found the bodies. They weren't scattered or torn apart by struggle. They weren't fighting or gasping for breath. They were huddled together. The 4 divers had stayed together in their final moments. It was as if they had accepted what was happening. There was no wild thrashing or desperate movements. They were still. They had run out of air, yes, but perhaps they didn't panic. They understood what had happened, and they chose to die together without fear. The way they were found shocked the rescue team. The stillness of their bodies, the way they were gathered in a corner of the cave, spoke volumes. The cave, with its cold grip, had taken them in a moment of complete silence. The rescue team brought their bodies out one by one, each recovery more painful than the last. They weren't just recovering the dead, they were uncovering the tragic truth about the dangers of cave diving. The Shaft, despite its beauty, had proven to be a silent killer. For the families and friends left behind, the pain of the loss was immense. But it also raised questions. How could 4 experienced divers have gotten so lost in a place they knew well? The answer, though hard to swallow, was simple. No matter how much gear you have, no matter how much experience you've gained, if you go too deep for too long, you'll pay the price. But while the shaft sealed its victims in silence, never giving them a second chance, another man, deep beneath the moors of northern England, was still alive and running out of time. That place was Stump Cross Caverns, a limestone cave system tucked within the wild heart of the Yorkshire Dales in England. Formed over 300 million years ago, the system stretches deep beneath the moorland, with a web of narrow, twisting passages carved by ancient water flow. Though much of it has been commercialized for tourism, several sections remain wild, accessible only to trained cavers. In 2010, an experienced caver ventured into one of the unlit, undeveloped sections of the cave system, a region closed to the general public and known only to a handful of seasoned explorers. The incident that followed has since become a sobering case study in the inherent dangers of subterranean exploration, particularly within limestone systems characterized by tight restrictions, unstable geology, and disorienting passageways. The individual was part of a small, independent caving team with authorized access to non-commercialized areas of the cave. These were no ordinary walk-through passages. Entry required crawling on stomachs, squeezing through rock fissures barely wide enough for a human torso, and navigating loose, potentially shifting stone. Conditions underground can be treacherous, but on this day, the risk of flooding, one of the greatest dangers in such environments, was ruled out. The surface weather was dry and calm, with no recent rainfall to suggest rising water levels underground. The group began their descent around mid-afternoon, bypassing the public show cave areas, which are well lit and reinforced, and making their way into a lower-level network of passages informally referred to by local cavers as the Extension. Unlike the safer, mapped sections of the cave, the Extension is a labyrinth of narrow rift passages, compressed ceilings, and treacherous bedding plane squeezes. Horizontal gaps in the rock often no more than a foot high. Navigating this zone demands not just physical endurance, but also an almost intuitive sense of spatial orientation. One wrong turn or misjudged maneuver can result in disorientation, or worse, entrapment. For the first part of the trip, progress was normal. The group was in regular verbal contact, and all members had headlamps, knee pads, helmets, and appropriate clothing for the damp, cold interior, where temperatures stay around 7 degrees Celsius year-round. Trouble began approximately 90 minutes into the exploration. The lead caver entered a particularly tight restriction, a horizontal squeeze that narrowed to less than 30 centimeters in height. It was a section known for being passable but physically demanding. At a certain point within the squeeze, the caver's chest became lodged. He could inhale but not exhale freely, causing his torso to expand into the surrounding rock. Attempts to reverse out of the squeeze failed. The angle of approach, combined with the rock's irregular shape, created a scene where every movement caused the body to wedge tighter. Efforts by the other team members to pull him back were unsuccessful. At this point, the decision was made to call for external help. One member of the team retraced the route back to the surface and contacted the Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association, a local volunteer organization trained in underground rescue. The call came in at approximately 4:45 p.m. Rescuers mobilized rapidly. By 5:30 p.m., the first team was on site. Due to the cave's layout, initial rescue personnel could not immediately reach the trapped caver. Narrow passages had to be negotiated with full gear, including medical kits, communication lines, and hand tools for potential rock removal. Reaching the casualty took over an hour. The squeeze was too tight for a full rescue crew to work inside. Instead, 2 slimline rescuers took turns entering the restriction, communicating with the trapped man and assessing options. The immediate priorities were to prevent hypothermia, to maintain breathing space to avoid further constriction of the torso, and to formulate a viable extraction method. A chemical heat pack was passed through as well as a thermal blanket. The caver remained conscious and responsive. No injuries were evident, but the position was severely uncomfortable and carried the risk of positional asphyxia. Rescuers worked with painstaking urgency, chipping away at the narrow limestone passage by hand. Every jagged edge had to be delicately broken off, using chisels and compact battery-powered drills. Each movement calculated to avoid triggering a deadly rockfall or destabilizing the fragile ceiling above. In cave rescues, progress is measured not in meters, but in agonizing centimeters. Communication with the surface was maintained through a specialized cave radio system known as hayphones, capable of transmitting signals through solid rock. Updates pulsed upward to keep anxious family members and emergency services briefed on the slow-moving operation. After grueling hours of inch-by-inch labor, the team finally managed to widen the squeeze just enough for the trapped caver to shift his torso. Carefully, they coated his arms and chest with lubricant, a critical step in tight passage rescues, then initiated a slow, nerve-wracking backward extraction, every tug a gamble between success and collapse. The process took more than 90 minutes from start to finish. By this point, the man had been trapped for over 7 hours. He was pulled free at approximately 11:30 p.m. Once clear, the team conducted a full medical assessment. Vitals were stable. He was placed in a stretcher as a precaution and guided slowly back through the cave network to the surface. The final exit was recorded just before midnight. Paramedics on standby at the surface evaluated him for circulation issues and any signs of compression trauma. He was released without the need for hospitalization. Stump Cross Caverns was not typically viewed as a high-risk site compared to deeper UK systems like Ogof, Fin and Dew, or Easgill. However, even shallow systems can pose serious danger when a caver becomes immobilized in a constricted space. Unlike diving or vertical caving, there is no equipment malfunction here, just a miscalculation of body positioning. After the rescue, the Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association held a detailed debrief and sent a full report to the British Cave Rescue Council. The report stressed how dangerous tight squeezes can be, especially when tackled alone or without team backup. It recommended using a special body gauge tool ahead of time to measure tight spots, and warned that all narrow sections should have a clear exit plan in place before anyone enters. Rescuers also advised carrying as little gear as possible when moving through tight tunnels, to prevent snagging or getting stuck. Even though the operation lasted many hours, experts it ended in a success. The team worked with sharp coordination, the cave's layout allowed steady progress, and the trapped man's condition remained stable, all key factors that helped bring him out alive. The caver was well experienced. He had the skills, the clearance, and the conditions on his side. But even the best can crumble underground, where the rules are different and the earth doesn't care how prepared you are. About 6 years earlier, deep in Mexico's dark cave, a team of British soldiers found that out the hard way. They weren't amateurs. They were trained, equipped, and organized. But once they were deep underground, nature took control, and escape became a race against time. That cave, known as Alpazad, lies hidden in the remote highlands of Puebla, a dark, winding system that few had ever heard of, until March 2004 when it became the focus of headlines around the world. That year, a group of British soldiers arrived in the small town of Quetzalén. The plan was simple. They were going into Alpazat Cave for a 3-day training mission. These men were part of a military caving group from the UK. They had done this before. They were used to dangerous terrain and tight spaces. For them, this was just another operation. The team included 12 men. 6 of them would stay near the entrance and handle communication. The other 6 would go deep into the cave to explore. They brought gear, maps, food, water, sleeping bags, and special equipment to send messages through rock. Everything was planned. But what no one planned for was the rain. As the soldiers moved deeper into the cave system, the skies outside opened up. Heavy rain began falling across the mountains. It didn't seem like a big deal at first, but these caves weren't dry. They were carved by water, and when it rains hard in this part of Mexico, it rains fast. The water rushed through the limestone. Streams turned into rivers. Rivers turned into floods. In a matter of hours, the cave system started filling with water. The soldiers deep inside Alpazat suddenly realized something terrifying. The way out was gone. The entrance tunnel had flooded. The cave had turned into a trap. They couldn't move forward. They couldn't go back. They were stuck, somewhere far below the surface, with no idea when the rain would stop or if help would ever come. Luckily, the team had planned for problems like this. They had set up an emergency camp high up on a dry rock ledge. It was stocked with food, sleeping bags, cooking tools, and even books. They couldn't escape, but they could survive for a while. For days, there was no contact with the outside world. No one in the town knew what had happened. Even the other 6 soldiers who had stayed near the entrance couldn't get a signal out. The rain kept falling, the water stayed high. The jungle outside remained quiet. Eventually, the surface team managed to send a message. They reached out to local Mexican officials for help. Villagers, rescuers, and cave explorers from the area offered to go in. But strangely, the British team said no. They insisted that help was coming from their own country. Mexican authorities waited. So did the families in Quetzalén. So did the world. 5 days passed. The 6 soldiers were still trapped underground. Food supplies were getting lower. The air was cold and wet. The water level wasn't dropping fast enough. Finally, help arrived from across the ocean. 2 of the UK's most experienced cave divers flew in, Richard Stanton and Jason Mallinson. These were men who had faced terrifying underwater caves before. They had rescued people from some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They geared up and entered Alpazat. What they saw inside was a nightmare. The water was pitch black. The tunnels were tight. The current was strong, but they pushed forward. 300 meters in, they reached the trapped soldiers. All 6 were alive. All 6 were still waiting. And now it was time to get them out. One by one, the soldiers were fitted with diving gear. With a guideline in place, they followed the divers through the flooded tunnels, slowly and carefully. It took hours, but after 8 long, terrifying days underground, all 6 men emerged from the cave, alive. The story exploded. Reporters rushed to the scene. TV crews arrived. Newspapers from around the world printed headlines about the dramatic rescue. But the questions started coming fast. Why were British military soldiers inside a Mexican cave? Why were they using tourist visas? Why had they refused help from local Mexican teams? The Mexican government was not happy. They launched an investigation. Officials suspected something more than just a training mission. Some thought the soldiers were looking for uranium. Others believed it was some kind of secret military operation. The British military denied everything. They said it was just a caving trip. In the end, all 13 members of the team were ordered to leave Mexico. They were banned from returning for 2 years. But while the British soldiers in Alpazat Cave were pulled out just in time, sometimes there is no rescue. Long before the Alpazat incident made headlines, deep in the untouched wilderness of New Zealand, another team prepared for descent. They were skilled. And yet, what waited for them inside the cave was something no training could prevent. On January 4th, 1960, deep in the New Zealand wilderness, a group of cavers embarked on an expedition that would end in tragedy. They were headed toward Harwood's Hole, one of the deepest and most challenging caves in the country. Harwood's Hole is a vertical shaft that plunges down over 180 meters into the earth. It's a place of awe and fear, a massive hole in the ground that seems to go on forever. The air is damp and heavy, and the only sound is the echo of voices bouncing off the walls. As beautiful as it is, Harwood's Hole is not a place for the faint of heart. The team of cavers, led by Peter Lambert, was well prepared for the descent. Lambert, a skilled and experienced cave explorer, had led many expeditions before. This was just another adventure, but one that would soon take a fatal turn. The plan was to explore the cave's depths and collect important data. The team had already spent hours preparing, gathering gear, and setting up ropes. As they geared up, the atmosphere was tense but excited. They were about to descend into one of the most challenging caves in New Zealand. Lambert and his team made their way to the edge of the shaft. The hole was wide, surrounded by jagged rock faces, and the only way down was to be hauled by rope, a slow but steady process. Lambert, being the leader, was the first to begin the ascent back to the surface after completing their exploration. Everything seemed to be going as planned, but in a split second, disaster struck. As Lambert was being pulled up, something unexpected happened. A massive boulder dislodged from somewhere above came crashing down from the depths of Harwood's Hole. There was no warning, no sound at first, just the sudden impact of the rock slamming into the side of the hole. It fell quickly, like a bullet fired from the darkness, and struck Lambert directly. The boulder hit him with such force that it knocked him from the rope, sending him tumbling into the depths of the cave. The other cavers watched in horror as Lambert disappeared from sight, the boulder now trapped in the narrow space around him. There was no way to predict the timing of the rockfall, no way to prepare for it. It was one of those freak accidents that no one could have foreseen. The rescuers immediately sprang into action, but the cave, with its tight spaces and dangerous terrain, made it almost impossible to retrieve Lambert quickly. The air was thick with dust and the scent of wet rock. The ground beneath them trembled from the force of the boulder's fall. The cavers knew they had to act fast. If Lambert was still alive, they couldn't afford to waste a second. They lowered ropes down into the hole, trying to reach the spot where Lambert had fallen. The space was too tight, the shaft too deep, and every move they made was a gamble. They could hear the distant sound of rocks shifting, the cave's warning signs that things were becoming unstable. With every passing minute, the risk grew. Yet, they pushed on, desperate to save their leader. But the fall had caused more than just physical damage. Lambert had been struck with such force that any chance of survival seemed slim. The rescue efforts turned into a recovery mission as the reality set in that there was no way out for him. The rescue team struggled for hours to secure a safe way to retrieve his body, but the sheer size and weight of the boulder made it impossible to get close enough. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Lambert's body was recovered. The team was left in shock, mourning the loss of their leader who had been such a critical part of their expeditions. His death marked the first recorded caving fatality in New Zealand, a stark reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the Earth's surface. As tragic as Lambert's fate was, it wasn't the last time nature would take its toll on unsuspecting adventurers. The next story takes us into the depths of the Rockfall cave system. On the afternoon of October 18, 2022, in the remote, hidden corners of France, a lone diver descended into the depths of the Rockfall cave system. Located in the heart of the Marcillac-sur-Sélé region, this cave system is notorious for its treacherous underwater passages, narrow tunnels, and dark, murky waters. It was a place where light barely penetrated, where the only sounds were the bubbles of breathing air and the muffled movements of equipment. The Rockfall cave system, like many others in the world, promised a journey into the unknown, an adventure for those brave enough to navigate its labyrinth of chambers and passages. The water was cold, the air thick with the damp smell of ancient rock, and every tunnel twisted deeper into the earth, beckoning with the challenge of discovery. The cave was not a place for the unprepared, but this particular diver, a seasoned veteran of underwater exploration, was confident in his skills and experience. He had trained for years in some of the world's most difficult cave diving conditions. Solo expeditions were something he had done many times before, each dive pushing the limits of his ability to withstand the dark, confined spaces beneath the earth. But no amount of preparation could have saved him from what would come. As the diver descended deeper into the murky water, he passed through tight tunnels and narrow passages, the darkness enveloping him completely. His light, a small beam in the vastness of the cave, illuminated only a few feet ahead of him. The water felt thick around him, almost suffocating, as if the cave itself was trying to swallow him whole. His movements were slow and deliberate, the weight of his equipment pulling him deeper into the unknown. But the deeper he went, the more isolated he became. The pressure of the water increased, and the narrowness of the tunnels forced him to maneuver with care. There was no turning back now. The further you go into a cave system like Rockfall, the more you become a part of it. Its cold, its stillness, its darkness. Then it happened. In an instant, a piece of his equipment, perhaps a tangled hose or a misplaced line, became caught in the rocks. The diver, who had been moving confidently just moments before, was suddenly trapped. His breathing became more frantic, the rhythmic sound of air bubbles now filling the silence of the cave. But there was no escape. The more he pulled, the more tangled he became, trapped in the claustrophobic grip of the rocks. In those desperate moments, the diver's only hope was the very equipment that had failed him. His lights flickered, the cold water pressing against his skin like 1,000 unseen hands. Every movement, every attempt to free himself, only seemed to worsen the situation. The water around him felt oppressive, the tunnel narrowing, the rock walls closing in. The diver knew that time was running out. The air in his tank was depleting, his oxygen supply slowly being drained as he struggled against the crushing weight of the cave. His mind raced, his body tired from the fight to break free, but the tight space left him with little room to maneuver. His heart pounded in his chest, the pressure mounting, not just from the water, but from the reality that he was trapped in the cold, unyielding darkness. He had faced difficult dives before, but nothing like this. The isolation of being alone in the deep water with no one to hear his struggle made the situation even worse. The cave, once a challenge to conquer, had turned into a merciless trap. The diver, now running out of time, fought desperately for air, but in the end, the cave consumed him. Hours passed before his body was found. The tightness of the tunnels, combined with the brutal nature of the entanglement, made it nearly impossible for any rescue efforts to reach him in time. By the time the recovery team arrived, it was too late. The diver had succumbed to the very environment he had spent his life exploring. But while some caves trap with ropes and rocks, others turn your own body against you. In the next story, it wasn't a fall or entanglement that brought a seasoned explorer to the brink of death. It was something far more silent and far more terrifying. Mark Dickey had always been the one to help others. As an expert caver and medic, he had spent years crawling through tight tunnels, exploring deep caves all over the world. But in 2023, Mark became the one who needed saving. Deep, deep inside Morca Cave, one of Turkey's darkest, most dangerous places, he found himself trapped, alone, and fighting for his life. It started out as just another expedition, Mark and his team had spent days preparing for the dive into the cave's belly. Their mission was simple: map out the cave and gather data. But nothing in this world is simple when you're that far underground. 1,000 meters below the surface, the cave began to feel alive, heavy, cold, and suffocating. The walls closed in, the air grew damp, and the only sound was the thud of their footsteps echoing through the tunnels. By the time they reached their base camp, the darkness was so complete that even their headlamps felt weak. Mark, usually calm and in control, began to feel strange. At first, it was just a faint discomfort in his stomach. Probably nothing serious, he thought. But as hours passed, the pain twisted into something worse. His stomach churned, then the blood started. First a small trickle, then vomiting, uncontrollable. His teammates watched in horror as Mark's condition quickly spiraled out of control. Suddenly the cave turned into something else. It was no longer a place of exploration, it was a prison, a trap. Mark couldn't move. His body was shutting down, fast. The pain was unbearable. His skin went pale, his breath shallow. His friends could only watch as he grew weaker by the minute. They knew they couldn't move him. There was no way to climb out with a man who was this sick. The nearest exit was 1,000 meters above them, and they were already too far in. They needed help, and fast. They sent out an emergency call, their voices cracking through the radio, begging for anyone to come. Above ground, a team was being assembled, but getting to Mark wasn't going to be easy. Morca Cave was a beast, a labyrinth of sharp rocks and frozen pools. Mark was trapped in a place where no one should have to fight for their life. But help wasn't coming fast enough. Days passed. While Mark's team waited in the dark, Mark's condition worsened. He became delirious, his body racked with fever and pain. He would slip in and out of consciousness, murmuring incoherently but never fully letting go. He was still alive, still hanging on, just barely. But his body couldn't hold out for much longer. Then help arrived. It wasn't just one rescue team, it was a global effort. Over 190 rescuers from 9 countries poured into Turkey. They had one goal: save Mark Dickey. But this wasn't going to be a quick rescue. The path out of Morca Cave was anything but simple. The first challenge was getting down to Mark, and the next was carrying him out. They had to move him on a stretcher, through narrow passageways, vertical shafts, and frigid underground rivers. Each move had to be slow, carefully planned. One wrong move could kill them all. Mark wasn't alone anymore, but that didn't make it easier. The rescuers battled through freezing water and jagged rocks, struggling to get him up the cave's unforgiving passages. They worked in shifts, each team taking their turn to carry Mark closer to freedom. But there was no easy way out. Mark needed IV fluids to stay alive, and they didn't have the luxury of waiting until they reached the surface. They gave him medicine, set up emergency lines, and kept him alive, underground. There were moments when it felt like the cave was swallowing them all whole. The air was thick. The pressure of the walls felt like it was squeezing in, pushing down on their chests. There was no light, no hope, except for the faint glow of their headlamps, cutting through the suffocating black. For 11 days, the team crawled, climbed, and dragged Mark closer to the surface. Each day felt like an eternity. The deeper they went, the harder it became. Some of the rescuers had to be pulled back, sick or injured from exhaustion. The air felt thinner, colder. It was as if the cave itself was trying to keep Mark and them inside. But then finally, after 11 days, after everything, they emerged. Mark was weak, pale, barely breathing, but he was alive. As Mark was pulled out of the cave, he was barely able to speak. His body was broken, but the fact that he was still alive felt like a miracle. Mark's heart had nearly stopped. His organs were shutting down. But somehow, through the grit and sweat of the rescue team, he made it out. He had survived. Mark was taken to a hospital, where doctors confirmed that his internal bleeding had been incredibly close to taking his life. The fact that he was still breathing was nothing short of a miracle. Everyone said the same thing: Mark should have never made it out. But he did. He was brought back from the brink of death by the hands of strangers who didn't know him, but wouldn't stop until they pulled him from the black depths of Morca Cave. And in the end, Mark was saved. But not every team makes it in time. Sometimes no amount of skill, no number of rescuers, and no years of experience can change the outcome. In the next story, one seasoned explorer enters a cave full of promise and finds only silence, stone, and the slow, crushing grip of death. It was supposed to be just another adventure. Brian MacArthur, an expert caver known for his calm composure and ability to navigate the tightest, most dangerous passages, was ready for something new. He had heard whispers of a system in the Appalachian mountains of eastern Tennessee, narrow, serpentine tunnels that few had explored. It was a challenge he couldn't resist. His excitement was palpable as he set off with his team, the thrill of discovery pushing him forward. The thrill of the unknown was what he craved most, but little did he know, that very unknown would soon become his worst nightmare. The air in the cave was thick with dampness, the faintest scent of earth and decay surrounding him. The tunnel before him twisted like a snake in the dark, a promising passage that beckoned him in. The walls were jagged and uneven, but Brian was used to such terrain. He'd squeezed through more tight squeezes than most could count, but this one felt different. This one had an unsettling silence to it. Still, his confidence pushed him forward. He had been in tighter spots before, deeper caves, more treacherous conditions. But what he didn't realize was that this tunnel wasn't just narrow. It wasn't just a challenge, it was a trap waiting to spring. As Brian crawled deeper into the passage, the walls began to press in on him, a subtle warning he ignored. He'd been in caves like this before, nothing to worry about. But with every movement, the tunnel seemed to grow smaller, the rocks pressing in on him like a vice. His body had to contort unnaturally to fit through the increasingly tight space. The stone scraped at his arms and legs as he pushed forward, trying to ignore the rising tension in his chest. It was a slow crawl, each movement more difficult than the last, the space around him narrowing and pinching his body in ways he had never experienced before. The rocks were jagged, and the air, what little there was, seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. Then, suddenly, he felt it, a sharp pressure against his shoulder. His chest constricted and his legs felt the sting of something sharp digging into them. For a moment, Brian paused, breath shallow, his body wedged in the corner of the tunnel. He tried to move, but the jagged rocks refused to yield. Panic started to creep in, the realization that he was stuck slowly dawning on him. The passage, once inviting, had become his worst enemy. His breathing grew shallow, each breath harder to take than the last. The tightness was unbearable, and the more he struggled to move, the more the passage seemed to tighten around him. The rocks pressed against his ribs and shoulders, pinning him in place. His legs were numb now, his body uncomfortably twisted in a way that made every movement feel impossible. Panic surged through him, but his mind raced. He couldn't stay here. Not like this, not now. He had to get out. But no matter how hard he pushed, pulled, or twisted, the rocks wouldn't give way. They were unyielding, as though the cave itself had decided to claim him. His legs were stuck, his torso crushed between the unforgiving rock, and with each breath, the space seemed to shrink tighter, squeezing the air from his lungs. The panic that had been creeping inside him now exploded, coursing through his veins. His heart hammered in his chest and sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought to free himself. But the more he struggled, the worse it became. The jagged edges of the rocks were tearing at him, their sharpness digging deeper into his skin with every movement. He was trapped in a nightmare, one where every effort to escape only made things worse. Then suddenly, the rocks shifted, just slightly, but enough. A jagged edge dug into his chest, and with a sickening crack, Brian felt the sharp rock crush his ribs. The air in his lungs was forced out, and his scream of agony was swallowed by the stone. His body twisted and his chest was pressed harder, impossibly harder, against the jagged rock. The pain was immediate, excruciating, but it was the suffocating pressure that soon became his greatest enemy. His breath came in desperate gasps, but the pressure on his chest made it impossible to take in enough air. His vision blurred, his body numb from the relentless crushing weight. There was no escape. Brian's team, still back near the entrance, heard his calls, heard his faint cries for help echoing through the narrow passages. But the more they tried to move toward him, the more disoriented they became. The cave, a labyrinth of twisting tunnels, was a maze. Every turn, every corner, led them further away from Brian. His cries grew quieter, more strained, and the team's panic mirrored his own. They were lost in the twisting maze of jagged rocks, no closer to him than they had been an hour ago. The rescue attempt was an agonizing struggle. Time was slipping away with every passing minute, and as the hours dragged on, the hope of getting Brian out alive began to fade. The team pushed harder, tried to think more clearly, but the cave seemed to mock them at every turn. Every step forward led to 2 steps back. The weight of the rocks pressing against Brian was unbearable, and his body, no longer able to withstand the crushing force, was slowly breaking. By the time they finally reached him, it was too late. Brian MacArthur, the experienced caver, the man who had explored countless caves, was gone. The rocks had taken him, and no amount of skill or willpower could have saved him. The team was left with only the cold, hard truth. Even the most experienced caver can be defeated by the very environment they love to explore. The cave had claimed him, and there was no escaping the reality of how quickly a simple adventure can turn into an irreversible tragedy. Up next, we'll be taking a look at the story of how the deadly crawl in Ellison's Cave, located on Pigeon Mountain in Georgia, claimed Cindy Reed in 2005. Cindy Reed had always been an adventurer at heart. A mother of two, she had found a unique way to bond with her teenage daughter, by exploring the world beneath their feet. For years, Cindy had wandered through caves, her passion for underground exploration as strong as ever. This time, however, was different. This time, she was bringing her daughter, Emma, along for her first real caving experience. It was supposed to be a moment of discovery, a memory they would cherish forever. They weren't alone. A small group of fellow cavers had joined them for the expedition into one of Utah's most remote cave systems. The excitement in Cindy's chest was palpable as she led Emma and the others toward the cave's entrance. She couldn't wait to show her daughter the wonders hidden beneath the Earth's surface, the beauty she'd fallen in love with all those years ago. At first, the cave was everything Cindy had promised, vast and open, a labyrinth of wide passages and towering rock formations. The light from their headlamps danced off the walls, casting eerie, beautiful shadows as they ventured deeper into the earth. Emma, wide-eyed and full of wonder, followed her mother through the majestic chambers, her excitement mirroring Cindy's own when she had first explored these tunnels. The air was thick with dampness, the coolness of the cave wrapping around them like a protective shroud. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The thrill of the cave, the excitement of the unknown. It was the perfect adventure. But as they moved further into the system, the cave began to change. The wide passages became narrower. The walls bent more, their sharp edges pressing in on them like the teeth of some great underground beast. The once spacious tunnels now twisted into an unforgiving maze. Cindy, ever the seasoned caver, didn't hesitate. She navigated the increasingly narrow passages with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime exploring caves like these. Emma stayed close behind, but Cindy could feel the tension building in her daughter. She knew this was the point where things could turn dangerous, but the cave had always been her second home. She had a confidence that came with years of experience. As they kept moving, she found a crawl space, smaller than the rest, a narrow passage that promised to lead to something more. It was just tight enough to spark Cindy's curiosity, just tight enough to make her want to see what lay beyond. It was supposed to be a simple crawl, something to show Emma the challenges of caving, but nothing could have prepared her for what would come next. Cindy squeezed into the tight space, eager to discover the chamber she hoped lay beyond. She could hear Emma's voice a safe distance from her, a soft murmur of excitement. But the moment she slid into the crawl space, everything changed. The rocks seemed to close in on her. At first, it was manageable. She crawled forward, pushing her body through the narrow gap, the rough stone scraping at her arms and legs. She could feel the pressure on her sides, but it wasn't unbearable. Not yet. She was determined to push forward, to show Emma just how amazing the world beneath their feet could be. But then the rocks began to shift, slowly, methodically, as if the cave itself was alive, constricting its hold on her. The walls pressed in tighter. Cindy's heart began to race. She tried to back out, but the passage was too narrow, too tight. Her legs were caught, wedged between two unforgiving slabs of stone. The more she twisted, the more the rocks pressed down, locking her body in place. Panic crept in, rising in her chest like a wave. She pushed against the walls, trying to find purchase, trying to pull herself free, but it was no use. The harder she struggled, the more the rocks seemed to pinch her body, pressing against her ribs, her legs, her back. The pain was immediate, a sharp, biting pressure that forced the air from her lungs. She felt her ribs begin to crack, the crushing weight making it impossible to breathe. The walls, once just a narrow obstacle, now seemed like an unrelenting trap, slowly squeezing the life out of her. In a panic, Cindy's mind raced. She had been in tight spots before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a crawl, this was a deadly vice. Her body was breaking, she could feel it. The weight of the rock was unbearable, pressing down on her chest, squeezing her ribcage, making every breath a battle. Her legs were numb, her arms trapped at her sides. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. All she could do was writhe in agony, every movement only making things worse. Emma quickly backed away and ran to get help. The rescue group tried to move quickly to reach her, but the narrow passages twisted and turned, confusing them, slowing their progress. It was a maze, and every minute that passed made Cindy's situation more critical. They were losing her. As they finally reached the crawl space where Cindy was trapped, it was already too late. The rocks had squeezed the life out of her. Her body, battered and broken, was crushed beyond hope. There was nothing they could do. The walls of the cave had taken her. There was no escaping the crushing reality of the unforgiving terrain. The group could only stand in stunned silence, the cold reality settling in. The cave, once a place of adventure and wonder, had become a tomb. But the cave wasn't done. Hundreds of miles away, in the scorched shadows of Death Valley, another explorer was about to discover that even the most breathtaking beauty underground can carry a silent, crushing threat.
In the heart of the American Southwest, nestled among the jagged cliffs and rolling hills of Death Valley National Park, California, lies Echo Canyon, a renowned yet notorious cave system that has drawn adventurers and cavers for decades. Known for its winding, labyrinthine passages and dark, unforgiving tunnels, Echo Canyon has a reputation for both its breathtaking beauty and its terrifying complexity. The cave system, though a marvel of nature, is not for the faint-hearted. The walls seem to shift in the dark, and the passages narrow so dramatically that they can swallow a person whole. Despite the warnings, it is a place that beckons to those with an insatiable desire for exploration, just like Jason Talbot. Jason, a seasoned caver with a deep love for the sport, was drawn to Echo Canyon like a moth to a flame. For him, caving wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. He had spent years navigating some of the most treacherous underground landscapes in the world, and Echo Canyon was the final frontier on his list. Jason's determination to conquer the cave system, despite knowing its dangers, was part of what made him such an experienced and confident adventurer. With a group of like-minded cavers, he entered Echo Canyon on a crisp autumn day, unaware that this trip would soon become a nightmare. The group descended into the cave, eager to explore its many chambers and marvel at the stunning stalactites and stalagmites that decorated the walls. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and chatter as they wound their way deeper into the dark heart of the cave. Jason, as always, was a step ahead, scanning the rock formations and making mental notes of any unusual features. He loved finding hidden corners of caves, places that few others had dared to go. As they moved through the main passages, everything seemed normal, but Jason, ever the explorer, wasn't content to follow the beaten path. While the others lingered, admiring the beauty of the cave's main chambers, Jason spotted something that piqued his curiosity. A narrow, winding passage off to the side seemed to beckon him. It wasn't much, just a faint crack in the rock, barely wide enough to slip through. But to Jason, it was the perfect opportunity to uncover something untouched by human hands. Without much hesitation, he told the group he was going to check it out and squeezed his way into the passage. At first, it was an exciting challenge, the tightness of the space only adding to the thrill. But as Jason pressed on, the passage began to grow narrower and more treacherous. The walls closed in around him, forcing him to inch forward, his body scraping against the cold stone. The air grew thicker, and the familiar sound of his breathing echoed ominously in the confined space. The passage twisted, narrowing into sharp turns, making it harder to move forward. Jason didn't think much of it at first. He was used to these tight spaces, but as he continued, something began to shift. The passage no longer felt like an exciting exploration. It felt like a trap. The more he crawled, the more he realized just how deep he was getting into the cave. The passage twisted in strange directions, and before long, he couldn't remember which way he'd come. Panic started to creep in, but Jason pushed it down, convinced that he could retrace his steps. After all, he had always found his way back in the past. But this time, things were different. The darkness around him seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on him from all sides. He turned to head back, but the tunnel had changed. What had once been a straightforward path now seemed to stretch into a maze of jagged rocks and blind corners. Jason's heart began to race as he realized the truth. He was lost. His flashlight, his only source of light, began to flicker and sputter. He tried to steady it, but the light dimmed further, casting long shadows across the walls. The isolation was suffocating. The cave seemed to swallow every sound. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the rock, swallowed by the silence. Panic surged, his breath quickened, and he could feel his body growing cold with fear. Every turn seemed to lead deeper into the unknown, the passage narrowing even more until he was forced to squeeze his body through spaces he didn't think were possible. Jason's mind raced as he tried to stay calm, but the pressure was building. He knew he had to get out, but with every twist and turn, the way back seemed more and more impossible. He could feel his muscles starting to cramp, his body covered in dirt and cuts from the jagged rocks. His hands were raw from trying to find purchase on the unforgiving stone. He tried to scream, to call for help, but the words caught in his throat. he felt completely alone. As the hours stretched on, Jason's situation grew more dire. His body ached, his muscles screamed for relief. But he knew he couldn't stop. The darkness, the silence, and the weight of the cave seemed to press in on him from every angle. His mind began to falter, and thoughts of escape felt more distant with each passing minute. The isolation was overwhelming, and the crushing silence seemed to mock his every effort. His flashlight, flickering erratically, offered no reassurance. The battery was dying, and Jason was left with only the dimmest glow. Every step felt like a battle against his own mind. The panic set in again. Deeper now, more real. He started to hallucinate, seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing noises that didn't exist. His body was weak, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every breath. Jason's will to survive was the only thing keeping him moving forward, but with each passing hour, it grew harder to hold on to that hope. He collapsed against the cold stone, exhausted, his breath ragged and shallow. His strength was waning, and he realized that escape might not come. The cave had swallowed him whole, and now it was closing in. In those final moments, Jason's mind raced as he fought for air. His body pressed tight against the rock, unable to move. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, and the light he had clung to so desperately faded, until there was nothing left but the suffocating quiet of the cave. His voice, once filled with hope and determination, was now nothing more than an echo lost in the vast, uncaring depths of Echo Canyon.
But deep beneath another American mountain range, danger took a different form. Not in twisting mazes, but in a vertical world where even a single wrong turn could leave you wedged in stone, with no way back.
First story takes place in the winding caves of northern Georgia, specifically Pigeon Mountain's Ellison's Cave, one of the deepest and most treacherous caves in the continental U.S. Known for its vertical shafts and unforgiving terrain, this is not a place for beginners. And yet, on July 15, 2014, two brothers, 18-year-old Caleb Foster and his older brother Daniel, 23, decided to tackle it anyway. They weren't totally unprepared. Daniel had done a few caves before, mostly small ones. Caleb, on the other hand, was brand new to it all. This was his first vertical cave, and Ellison's Cave was unforgiving, even for seasoned cavers. The brothers had heard of a formation called the Tight Side Passage, an infamous squeeze that was barely talked about in guidebooks. It wasn't part of the main route, but a few online forums mentioned it as a fun challenge for anyone daring, or foolish enough to try it. Caleb, excited and eager to impress his brother, insisted they check it out. They located the entrance to the side passage after descending into the main shaft and navigating about 1,000 feet into the cave system. The passage was harmless at first, just a low tunnel carved through soft limestone. It gradually narrowed as they crawled in, the walls pulling in tighter, the floor angling downward. Daniel hesitated, uncertainty creeping in as he glanced at the dark tunnel ahead. They didn't know how far it went, and the thought of getting stuck gnawed at him. But Caleb, already moving with an eager grin on his face, slipped forward, undeterred by the narrow passage. He seemed to treat it like a game, confident he'd only go a little ways before turning back. The sound of his movements echoed softly, blending with the eerie silence around them. The squeeze narrowed fast. The ceiling lowered until Caleb had to flatten his arms against his sides just to slide forward. The walls pinched around his chest and hips. Still, he pressed ahead. He believed if he could just get around the next bend, it would widen up again. He was wrong. The passage curved downward and hooked to the left like a fishhook. Caleb didn't see the full shape until it was too late. The rock bent his spine at an unnatural angle as he tried to slither around the curve. His knees wouldn't follow, his back locked. He tried to twist, but there was no room. His body began to wedge. At first, it was manageable, uncomfortable, sure, but nothing he couldn't push through. Then the panic hit. He sucked in a breath and realized he couldn't fully expand his chest. Every inhale felt thinner. Every exhale felt like a countdown. He tried backing out, but the way the curve bent his body, he couldn't reverse it. His hips were caught, and the way his legs were positioned, any movement only lodged him deeper. The rock had him now. He shouted for Daniel, his voice muffled, bouncing awkwardly off the contorted stone around him. Daniel scrambled toward the entrance of the side passage. He could hear Caleb, but he couldn't see him. "Back out! Crawl backward!" he yelled. "I can't!" Caleb screamed, his voice high and raw. Daniel dropped to his belly and began crawling in. The passage was already tight, but he made it a few feet before reaching the bend. That's where he saw it. Caleb's feet were barely visible, his boots twitching as he tried to free himself. The rest of his body was swallowed by the rock. Daniel realized, with growing horror, that Caleb was wedged in a position where his legs were twisted sideways, and his chest was compressed against a curve that left him almost upside down. "Try to move your hips! Twist left!" Daniel shouted. "I can't breathe!" Caleb gasped. Daniel tried pulling at his brother's legs, but nothing gave. The angle of the passage meant any pulling just compressed Caleb more. Time passed in minutes that felt like hours. Caleb's breathing got worse. The curve had locked his ribcage, forcing his lungs to work double just to take in air. His face, now slick with sweat, was pressed sideways against cold rock. His helmet had fallen off somewhere behind him. His left arm was pinned behind his back. His right hand clawed at the rock helplessly. Daniel had no signal, no GPS, no radio. They were deep underground, and no one else knew where they were. "I'm gonna get help," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "No, don't leave me. Please." Caleb's voice was weaker now. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct told him to stay, but without help, his brother was going to die right there in the rock. He gave Caleb his water bottle, maneuvering it to his lips as best he could. Then he slowly backed out, his heart pounding loudly in his chest. It took Daniel over 40 minutes just to make it back to the entrance. He ran barefoot now, his boots shredded from the rock, down the mountain trail to the nearest ranger station. What followed was a full-scale rescue operation that mobilized over 24 specialized cave rescuers from surrounding states. But even for them, the situation was dire. The passage Caleb was trapped in was so narrow that only the slimmest rescuers could make it to him. And even then, they couldn't reach his upper body. They tried everything, pulling gently on his legs, drilling into the rock around the curve, even bringing in a specialized air tube to keep him breathing. But hours passed without any success. Caleb was still alive, but barely. The position he was stuck in, head at a downward angle, chest compressed, legs twisted behind him, was slowly cutting off the blood flow. His heart was working overtime. One rescuer described it as trying to pump uphill with a collapsed lung. He was starting to lose consciousness, slipping in and out, hallucinating from the pain and lack of oxygen. They tried to chisel the rock away, but the vibrations only worsened his condition. One wrong move could crush his chest entirely. Finally, after 27 hours trapped in the passage, Caleb's breathing stopped. The rescuers couldn't reach far enough to perform CPR. He died wedged inside the rock. Daniel was inconsolable. He had to be physically restrained from trying to crawl back in himself. For 3 days, rescuers debated how, or even if, they could recover Caleb's body. But the decision was eventually made to seal the passage. They marked the location, leaving a plaque at the entrance. To this day, Caleb Foster's body remains inside the tight side passage of Ellison's cave, his final resting place entombed in stone.
It doesn't matter if you're a solo expert with decades of experience, a trained military team, or part of a well-organized expedition. Down there, in the silence beneath the surface, everything changes. The rules bend, the air tightens. The smallest mistake or the slightest shift in nature can turn into disaster. These 10 stories are just a glimpse into the brutal reality of cave exploration. For some, it ends in survival. For others, in tragedy.